Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome back to my channel. Here is me with horrendous, sort of sweaty, disgusting hair. Please look past that. If needs be, just cover the screen and just listen. But today I wanted to talk about a Booker Prize icon and just a well-known and established author in his own right outside of the prize, which is Ian McEwan. And Ian McEwan is an author who was probably one of the first authors that I properly read, as in that I really remember reading, that I remember really enjoying a book as a sort of a teenager. And then sort of, I think now, if I'm right, I think I've read all of his books apart from one short story collection, maybe. But Ian McEwan is an author who, at least in the UK, is very, very well known, particularly for some of his bigger books, such as Atonement, which was also turned into a film. And for books like Amsterdam, which won the Booker Prize. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about his writing more generally, looking through the Booker Prize as he was shortlisted 5 times. And I say was shortlisted as if he'll never be shortlisted again. That may well happen, judging by some of his recent books. I'm not sure how long we might be waiting for that to happen again, because in my opinion, there was definitely a really strong period and some other books since which have been enjoyable, but I don't think necessarily kind of are as strong. And that sounds harsh, but you know what, his other, like, lots of people still enjoy reading him. He still does lots of really great stuff. He's doing fine. So, starting way back in 1978, he released The Cement Garden, and this was not Booker Prize shortlisted, but he didn't have to wait particularly long. His next book did. But it's worth saying these early books of his are really typified and kind of categorized often as his sort of macabre phase. Sort of, he was known sort of jokingly as Ian Macabre for this, because his short story collections around this time, so First Love, Last Rites, In Between the Sheets, Cement Garden, the novel, and then the next couple of novels were all pretty grim in terms of subject matter. Lots of shocking things happening, lots of, for example, just murders that were quite cold-blooded, lots of quite sexual scenes, but often sort of quote-unquote disturbing sex, I guess, so often with sort of minors having sex or ideas around incest, or he kind of went there, should be said. But anyway, this was sort of an early period of his, and you know, he's an author I really enjoy. I realize it sounds like I'm bashing him for some of these books I think are incredible, but anyway, so his second novel, The Comfort of Strangers, earned him his first Booker Prize shortlist. This is a book that is all about this couple who go on holiday to somewhere that I don't think we're explicitly told where it is, but it's basically Italy. It's a very short book, but he gets drawn into the life of this couple. This couple, so his couple, the couple we start with, get kind of drawn into the life of this other couple, but particularly this one man, and we're introduced to this sort of somewhat strange man. There's this sort of homoerotic kind of note between around the idea of that man and the man in the couple who we're sort of hearing the story through. But it's also both sort of very sexual but also very violent. We are told that there is this, we meet this other woman who's part of the other couple, but she seems quite timid, she's quite scared, it seems like she's always looking over her shoulder. And so the two characters that we start with, this sort of main couple, seem to start to think that there is something going on, that perhaps she is in an abusive relationship or have you, and they in their own way try to step in. However, in the process, it leads into this whole plot around it almost seeming like there's going to be a murder, and this idea that, is it going to be murder that's kind of with a very sexual element of kind of wanting to kill each other, and kind of be part of a really strong kind of sexual game essentially for murder. So classic Ian McEwan then, basically. I definitely see why this was shortlisted. I think this is an incredibly strong novel of Ian McEwan's, particularly for his earlier work. I really enjoyed it. I think it's done so brilliantly. The psychosexual tension of it all is off the charts and I think is brilliant. But also is a book that I think made a lot of people uncomfortable, and for good reason. And I really enjoy this. I think Ian McEwan does really push that button in terms of that line of when it is too uncomfortable for you. And he often hits it in a way that really divides people. I think some of his later work is a lot more successful at it personally, but that's sort of early on into his career. And so we see Ian McEwan not particularly deviate from some sort of shocking and kind of terrifying ideas. We get The Child in Time next in 1987, which is sort of around a kidnapping and the effect that that has on a couple, and how it sort of both drives a wedge sort of within them, but also perhaps sort of solidifies other parts of their relationship, and really, really interestingly done. Ian McEwan, sort of time and time again, does sort of seem to bring in children in quite an interesting way in books. They're often sort of pawns in a game in some way. So either they've been abandoned and they do sort of childish things, or they have been attacked or kidnapped. He's quite unsparing with them. And then next we had The Innocent, which this is really interesting because I think this is a time when Ian McEwan, you can sort of see what was happening sort of geopolitically often through Ian McEwan novels. So both in 1990 with The Innocent and in 1992 with Black Dogs, we get this idea of things around the Cold War and kind of quite interesting, gripping, tight things during that. And so The Innocent kind of definitely sort of goes into that. We kind of get this sort of Cold War plot. Not as successful, I think. I mean, I still enjoyed it, but it's not one of my favorites necessarily. And then that leads us to his second Booker shortlist his next shortlist nomination. That works. And this was Black Dogs. So as I mentioned, this kind of has a Cold War feel. This sort of very much concerns this sort of married couple. So a son basically writing a biography of his mother, and in the meantime trying to find out what exactly happened to break up his parents, who both used to be communists and used to have that as their sort of their thing, but very quickly broke up. And we get this real sense that there's been an attack, and that attack and the sort of fallout from that has been what has sort of really created an issue between them. But also we're meant to question what the attack is, because the attack is by Black Dogs, allegedly. But it also seems that we start wondering whether we're really being told the truth about this. There's also a link between Black Dogs and Churchill talking about depression. And so we start wondering if there are some other factors playing in around this, and a really fascinating book in its own way. So this was shortlisted for the 1992 Booker Prize. Again, it's interesting because there are some of his that were shortlisted that I'm like, okay, I don't fully see it for this one. I kind of wonder if this book also felt more powerful during its time, during the kind of Cold War or kind of post, because this concerns a little bit about the Berlin Wall, sort of from '89, and so this book comes out soon after. I feel like it's maybe very zeitgeisty in that sense, but I do also wonder, for me, I don't know if it necessarily still works. It's still really powerful in a lot of ways, and it does a lot in a really short amount of space. I think it's about 160 or so pages long, so really short, but yes, does some really interesting things. And then Ian McEwan seems to go into a really different period of his career, and for me there are now 6 books in a row that I see as some of his best, and that are some of my absolute favorites of Ian McEwan. So maybe this is my favorite Ian McEwan period, and this is also where he gets Booker Prize shortlists a bit, so other people agreed. So next up is Enduring Love. So this is a story all about a man who it starts off with a hot air balloon incident, and in the meantime, in trying to save someone's life, these two men kind of have this sort of moment, because obviously it's such a high stakes thing. But what that turns into is this character, our main character, being stalked, essentially. There's sort of mention of de Clerambault sort of syndrome, and essentially we get this really tight tension throughout the book of watching as other characters around him don't believe him at first, and sort of like, his wife or his partner, I think it is, disagrees and sort of thinks, well, are you hiding something from me? And increasingly she starts not believing him. We then, as the audience, start thinking maybe there's something right here, because the main character starts acting quite seemingly irrationally. He starts doing things, you know, he wants to stay away from this man who is convinced that he's in love with him and that it's God's mission for him for those two men to fall in love. And he's convinced of this. And our main character seems not to kind of necessarily follow along with that. He kind of will meet him, for example, instead of just saying, really leave me alone. And that starts to seem suspicious. And his wife, also his partner, raises similar questions of, actually, why is it that you keep meeting him? I thought you said that he was terrifying and that we should be avoiding him. What's happening here? And also, he seems to be obsessed with him. He's thinking about him a lot. There's an attempted murder. People seem to think that there seems to be this other sort of plot around the background of that. And it really starts making you guess, sort of second guess him as a character in a way that almost feels like the book's kind of gaslighting you at various points, but in a really interesting way, because it kind of feels like every character is being gaslit by somebody else. And I think what really tips this book over the edge to me to make it really powerful and brilliant is there is a wonderful appendix section. There are bits of this book where I feel like Ian McEwan does something, kind of creeps in here, which I've noticed in a lot of other Ian McEwan books, is he's got a kind of academic principle or thought that's running through the book, and he makes no bones about telling you that explicitly. So, for example, telling you in detail about de Clerambault syndrome, but then also detailed discussions around the existence of God. Ian McEwan's atheism comes up a lot in books. But I think what's really clever about how this is woven in, I mean, because I didn't always like it, but it's brought to a really powerful end in the appendix, where we suddenly get both a report from the British Review of Psychiatry, which is then sort of meant to be presented as almost like a case study talking about what's happened. And we also get a sort of moment at the end where we hear a letter. We hear a letter from the man who has been stalking our main character all the way through. And that is really unsettling as an end to the book, because we know that in theory our main character has been kept away from harm, but has he? Nothing has really changed apart from this person being far away. And we get this real insight into the trauma around things like stalking or harassment, where even after the person doing the harassing has stepped back or is arrested or whatever, the looking over your shoulder never quite goes away. And that, I think, is done so beautifully and powerfully in Enduring Love. And I am really, this was, I think, pretty much one of the last books of his that I finally read. And I've had this on my shelf for years. I'm really glad to finally read it. I think it's done so powerfully and interesting. Also, I should have said in the one for Black Dogs, there's this really nice old picture of Ian McEwan here, which is quite sinister, really. But I also love the idea that now he's sort of, you know, he's got his updated profile, his updated picture, but loads of authors must have all these sort of jacket pictures from, you know, the 80s or the 90s, where they just look really kind of like suave and very, like, in a very 80s 90s way of like, yes, I'm just here in my leather jacket looking really cool and authory. And I wonder how they feel about those now. If you're wondering why my hair seems to change quite radically between each like cut, it's essentially because I'll record a bit and then like wipe my face because I realize how much I'm sweating. Life is great. I love the summer. Summer is my favorite season. Carrying on with my favourite part of Ian McEwan's bibliography, we then come to Atonement. No, we don't. We come to Amsterdam. We come to Amsterdam, which earned him the Booker Prize win. And it's an interesting one because I think for a lot of people, we sort of recognise Amsterdam as not being Ian McEwan's best work, potentially. I love it. I really like Amsterdam as a book. It talks about these two men who want to die, essentially, or kind of agree almost a thing to kind of take their own lives, and go to Amsterdam to do it, because at the time assisted suicide was sort of became a thing. And I remember, I mean, I would have been 9 when this book came out. I remember these discussions being really big at the time, when I think both the Netherlands and Switzerland made it possible for sort of things like assisted suicide. And this is very Ian McEwan to pick up on something like that from the news that's both a moral question but also has a degree of discomfort, you know, with the idea of death. That is very Ian McEwan. Like, what's a moral issue that people have a lot of feelings about and is quite grim and doesn't necessarily lead to great places? Yep, let's go for that. Let's write a book around it. And so these, what I personally love about this novel is the way that there's a kind of creeping sense of dread throughout the book. That these two men both go beyond their morals in a way that they are not happy with, and then have to make a very moral decision around assisted suicide. And so for me, I think that's what makes it really brilliant. It is surprising looking back at all of Ian McEwan's work that this is the one that won the Booker and not the next book I'm about to talk about. But at the same time, I think it made sense, kind of given that shortlist a little bit. It's a shortlist I quite enjoyed, but I think Amsterdam was one that I think it made sense to win. It's a really powerful book in my opinion, and just does some really interesting things. And that takes us to Atonement, his probably best known book, which was turned into a film, which was a major bestseller. I at one point was doing some research for a prompt from a tag, and about like a popular book that I enjoyed. Maybe it was my own tag. Maybe I made that difficult for myself. I think it was on the Eurovision one. And I was really interested to see that when you look at sort of best-selling novels in the UK, you've obviously got all the big examples that you normally expect. So Harry Potter, kind of quite popular literature, so things like Dan Brown, other books like that. And then Ian McEwan's Atonement is fairly high up there. It's selling like 1.5 million copies or something, which is bonkers. That's a lot of books. And Atonement is so interesting. So this, I've spoken about it a little bit before in other videos, but Atonement is this whole idea of this young girl sees some things as a child, and this is just before World War II, and she sees some things that she is convinced are right. So she thinks that she has seen a sort of man who's known to the family, sort of the boyfriend of her sister, trying to rape her. He thinks he sees that. She thinks she sees that. And it kind of later turns out that actually they were both just having consensual sex in the library. But as a young girl, she doesn't fully understand what's happening. He thinks he's attacking her, he's attacking her sister. And she does some things, she makes some choices that essentially lead to a really terrible life for this man for a while, puts him at incredible risk of danger, because it essentially means that when war starts, he's put in a certain battalion and all these other things. And the idea of atonement is then really interesting as a title, because how can she ever atone for something that she did when she was young, when she made such a big mistake, but she saw it through, even though she knew at one point that she was lying, or at least not fully telling the truth. This book does some incredible things. I kind of reread it this year, and I forgot just how tense and tight the writing is of this. It is almost perfection in parts, I think. It's so well handled. The second section of the book, where we see the young girl as an older woman, Bryony, I think her name is, we see her as an older woman, is brilliant. But it also does some really interesting things in playing with the idea of a reliable narrator, because she's kind of unreliable as a young girl, but then in some ways equally unreliable as a woman, as an older woman, when she knows her own mistakes, because she sort of submits this manuscript of everything that's happened, and we start wondering if the novel that we've just read is all a figment of her imagination as well. So really, really interestingly and powerfully done. And also obviously is a great chance to wheel out Keira Knightley to do another sort of another period piece. So I mean, that's always good. And it involves the wonderfully beautiful James McAvoy, which again, always a treat. So there we go. And the next we have Saturday. Now this was longlisted, I believe, for the Booker, but did not make the 2005 shortlist. The 2005 shortlist being, so far, from all the shortlists I've read, one of my absolute favourites of all time. I just think all the books on there are brilliant. And so in that sense, it makes sense to me that Saturday did not make it, because Saturday, as good as it is, I don't think maybe is as strong as some of the others. So Saturday takes place all over one day, and is largely focused around a protest against the Iraq War. Now, again, this is where the timeliness of Ian McEwan comes in, because those protests would have been taking place around 2003. This book came out in 2005. Ian McEwan is quick for these kinds of things. He's very, very timely with a lot of these. And what I think is so interesting about this book is how he sort of manages to chart this whole day with these sort of violent actions and make it feel sort of tense and tight. But again, I don't think it's necessarily his strongest book. It does some really interesting things though. Ian McEwan here kind of explores this idea again around what it really means to live in a sort of modern day society, what some of the difficulties, I guess, essentially with violence and sort of terrorism. And it's, you know, it's worth noting that after 9/11 in 2001, there were so many discussions around civil liberties and around personal freedoms and the role of the state and the role of the state in international politics. And this book very much hits those markers. So Ian McEwan, again, being very, very on the moment. And I think that's sometimes a thing. It's interesting because when looking back, most of the books I enjoy the most of Ian McEwan's are the ones that are a bit more timeless. They're not wed to a specific time, or if they are, it's been a long way off. So, for example, Atonement, focusing in around sort of the time, but just before and after World War II, that works in some ways because it's a bit more, he's got more of a step back. I think sometimes the difficulty with Ian McEwan writing a book about the current moment is that conversation can move quite quickly. And so sometimes it's quite weird to go back and try and remember what the context was for the book in the time it was written. But I still think Saturday does some really interesting things, and again is sort of very typical McEwan. And this takes me to maybe my favourite Ian McEwan book of all time, which I desperately need to reread, and that is On Chesil Beach. And this book does, this is gorgeous, it's so short but so powerful, and it focuses on this young couple who basically are sort of on their honeymoon night go to have sex for the first time, and there is all sort of forms of sexual dysfunction almost that happen, and it doesn't happen, and essentially there's a massive breakup in this relationship. And this book does something incredible for me, which is that lingering, yearning ache of unresolved issues. So the idea that this couple could have a really long time apart after this occasion, but both be on each other's thoughts in quite a big way, and it never being resolved. It's never sort of ended. The sense of shame in this novel is so powerfully done at kind of capturing the sort of vulnerability of sex, and as a result the shame that can come from it. I just think this novel is a class act. I see why The Gathering by Anne Enright won. I love that book, it's brilliant, but part of me almost wants, especially with sort of the double winners, you know, the fact that double winners have sort of existed you know, in 2019 Booker, I would have loved to have seen this be another winner with Anne Enright. I just think it's great. I love this book so much. And then we enter sort of a bit of a part of Ian McEwan's career that I'm not the biggest fan of, and I don't want to sound like I'm completely trashing him. There is still a lot of stuff going on in these books that is great, and by goodness, I wish I could write like this and be published. But these are not necessarily my favourite books, but I'll kind of go through them quickly now. None of these were shortlisted for the Booker. So we have Solar in 2010, which focuses in again on a moral and sort of scientific issue in question around solar power, but also around science and the role with humanity. Does some really interesting things, but overall I just found there were whole sections of this book that I found a little bit like a physics lecture, which might do it for some people, but I think for me that the comparing this to something like Amsterdam, for me, Amsterdam or maybe Enduring Love or Black Dogs had its kind of literary and intellectual point that it was trying to make, but did weave in quite a lot of storytelling alongside that. For me, Solar feels like it really tips into the kind of intellectual side and sometimes loses a bit of the idea of being a novel. That said, I did listen to it as an audiobook, and maybe that makes those scientific bits a little bit more painful than they would otherwise have been. I sort of do feel like maybe if I read it as a physical book, I would have been maybe a little bit more invested in the science bits, and maybe that would have changed things. I don't know. Then we have Sweet Tooth, and this is a sort of spy, almost like a spy drama in some way, and I wasn't massively on board with this until towards the end. There is a really interesting twist that is done. There are some really great moments, and again, I think the use of voice in this book is actually really good. I think he's very good in this book at capturing how certain people talk, particularly this sort of main character, this spy, and how she moves through the world. I was really gripped by that. Maybe again I'm being harsh because I'm judging Ian McEwan by Atonement, On Chesil Beach, and so anything he writes that isn't that, I'm like, where is Chesil Beach? I need Chesil Beach in my life. Then we have the Children Act, which actually I really enjoyed. I think this was great. And also I think there's a film version with Stanley Tucci, who is again adorable. And the Children Act is largely around a lawyer navigating a moral issue. Can we see a common theme through McEwan here? There's a strong moral issue about the right to, I think it was giving blood and sort of organ donation and sort of surgery, because there's a character who is incredibly ill, but they are from a family of Jehovah's Witnesses, and so they do not accept blood or kind of organs from other people's bodies. And it turns into a moral issue with this judge character at the heart of it, of trying to assess this argument and come down on one side of respecting the right to religion and to people to live their own lives as they see fit, or focusing in on saving this person's life or giving them a better quality of life by going against their beliefs, but to save their life or to give them more. And again, this is a moral issue that I think Ian McEwan does really well. He's not a big fan of religion, it has to be said. He is an atheist. And so I think any book where there is a religious aspect to the moral discussion, Ian McEwan perhaps goes a little bit hard on the religious side. I'm not religious myself, but I do kind of get the feeling at times it tips over into just being like, well, religion's just really stupid. And you're like, okay, Ian, right, thank you for that part of the discussion. Let's think about this more deeply. Like, people actually have a really strong connection to their faith, and actually sometimes it can come across a bit snarky, in my opinion, towards them. But this book does some really interesting things. And I think for me, the clarity of voice throughout this book is so powerful. I think it's so well told and so interesting. And then we get the last three where Ian McEwan's kind of on his sort of moral kind of thing, but a little bit, it's very much poking the bear. It's kind of finding the hot button issues in the country at the time and really trying to go for it. So Nutshell is probably his most controversial in terms of the content. And this feels like early in McEwan in some ways coming through. Like it really goes hard on some of the issues. And I think it's only maybe kind of credit to his skill as a writer that it doesn't slide into anything worse, potentially. But Nutshell is the idea of, it's told through the perspective of a fetus. And sort of more specifically, a kind of a fetus growing inside a woman, but born of infidelity. And so the baby, or the fetus, and again, this is part of Ian McEwan's discussion of how alive this character is. Obviously, he's kind of given them special powers in the sense that this fetus is basically understanding everything that's going on around them. But this fetus hears, essentially knows that his mother is having an affair, and he knows this partly through being able to hear through the womb and hear the kind of conversations that are happening. But he also knows that there is the father, the person who thinks he's the father is there as well. And there are some really, like, this is Ian McEwan really, I mean, this is controversial. And he essentially has an idea about, this sort of discusses a little bit about the idea of abortion, and at one point involves a scene of the fetus trying to abort itself by kind of trying to escape and essentially end its own life. It does a lot. So yeah, this was one of those ones where I think he announced, I have a fairly strong memory of him announcing this book idea and people being like, oh no, okay, Ian, are we going there? Are we really? It's kind of sensitively handled at times, others less so. But I do like the idea, almost, if you think of sort of something like Family Guy, and you've got this sort of, Stewie at the heart of that, who's this sort of baby who knows a lot, is sort of incredibly intellectually developed and knows a lot of things. It almost plays on that same idea of this fetus having insights that a fetus would not be expected to have, especially as babies would not be born with that kind of knowledge. But interesting as a sort of bit of a psychodrama around an affair, but but feels very, very McEwan. Then we have Machines Like Me, which explores this idea of sort of AI and sort of future technology, and again, in typical McEwan fashion, is basically around sex and violence and a moral issue about life or death, and the soul and personal freedom. And so does some really interesting things. I think it's decent. I think this novel does some interesting things. Part of me does feel like other people have maybe approached the idea of AI and future technology better, but I still have got to sort of take my hat off to Ian McEwan for still making this book incredibly readable, even if it's a bit... but yeah, and then in typical Ian McEwan fashion, what do we end up with? A Brexit novella. Yay! So I don't know what I was expecting. I don't know why I thought an author like Ian McEwan, who really likes to push hot button topics and explore them, I don't know why I didn't think that he'd be writing something around Brexit. And so we get this Kafka-esque idea that underneath all of these politicians, there are cockroaches who are sort of manipulating them, a little bit like the film Ratatouille, if you imagine that. They're almost like they're being driven by these cockroaches. And that is kind of his rather cynical, I think, look at kind of politicians. I think this is partly why for me this book isn't as successful, is I think the cockroach, and it kind of is almost too cynical and also not developed enough as an idea to really work. So instead you've kind of got these, like, it's like, oh, politicians, they're all a bit shady and a bit evil, they're all being run by cockroaches, and it feels almost a bit childlike, like childish at times for me, in that it feels like it's just sort of just like a weird kind of political thing of just like, oh no, like, oh, you know, the reason that politicians make such terrible decisions is because they were all being run by cockroaches, as opposed to really exploring the idea of evil or the idea of personal interest, or kind of, which I think is a more interesting novel as an idea, to potentially explore what would make a politician do that in a way that still made them human. Like, actually, why are some politicians doing such terrible things, but exploring that from a sense of what kind of motivations behind these people, as opposed to they're all just cockroaches, which I feel like is a lazy way out. But, you know, and I think also, I feel like now sort of both Brexit and COVID writing are going to be novels that I am going to find really difficult to read, because I think I am so angry, or so, part of it feels so immediate, but also part of it stirs up so many feelings within me that I don't know how I can approach those novels without being in a more objective sense, perhaps. I think someone like Ali Smith did this incredibly well with the Seasons trilogy, because I think Autumn and Winter explore this idea around Brexit in a really interesting way, but that doesn't feel kind of preachy or kind of just sort of blind anger. And I think Summer covers aspects of COVID really interestingly and really beautifully. I think Ian McEwan just sort of comes across a bit boomerish, unfortunately, in this novella. It feels just like a bit of a weird rant, and I think as a result it doesn't always work for me. There are some brilliant moments, some really funny moments that still feel very McEwan, but alas, some of the other bits are there. So anyway, those are all of the books that Ian McEwan has written, or was released, at least in terms of the novels. I haven't really touched too much on his short stories here, but those include those 5 Booker shortlisted books. So The Comfort of Strangers in 1981, Black Dogs in 1992, 1998's Amsterdam, Atonement in 2001, On Chesil Beach in 2007. As you may be able to tell from what how I've been talking about them all, I actually really enjoy most of the books that were shortlisted. For me, I think The Comfort of Strangers was really a really great kind of catch there, sort of really catching a young Ian McEwan early into his writing career and really sort of recognising the power in his writing. On Chesil Beach, I still think is my standout favourite, but Atonement is also brilliant. Amsterdam, I really enjoy. and he's just such an interesting author. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts about Ian McEwan, books of his you've read and maybe enjoyed or maybe not enjoyed, or if there are any books from this list that you think might interest you, or even people who just do some of these things better. Is there a better Brexit novel? Is there a better kind of AI novel? Anyway, take care. I hope you've enjoyed this. Apologies, I've been disgustingly sweaty throughout. I'm literally filming this at 9 p.m. and I'm still this warm. So great luck for me, you know, like going to bed tonight and trying to sleep. Love that for me. Anyway, take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.